Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, lecture series on the urinary system. In the last part of this section, we're going to talk about the acid-base balance that is being maintained in the blood. Talked before about the blood pH, and it has to remain in a very narrow range between 7.35 and 7.45. That's our homeostatic range. If it goes too high, we call that alkalosis, above 7.45, and if it's below, we call that acidosis, below 7.35. 7.35 itself is a little bit basic, so 7 is neutral, less than 7 is acidic, a low pH, above 7 is basic, and so if it's normally slightly basic. So what this means is that, well, if you look at the word acidosis, acidosis is talking about it being acidic. So below 7.35 we call acidosis, but in reality 7.35 is less than 7.35 is still basic until you get down below 7, and then it becomes acidosis. So we call physiological acidosis, we call that this little range between 7.35 and 7.0 before it literally becomes acidic, if that makes sense. We call this physiological acidosis because in reality it's not acidic, it's basic, but because it's more acidic than the blood normally should be, we call this physiological acidosis. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's look at the types of acids and things that are produced in the body. Phosphoric acid, lactic acid, fatty acids. So these are acids that are produced as a result of metabolism, body metabolism. We also have carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of metabolism as well, as we're burning oxygen in the food we eat to produce ATP, to have the energy to do all the functions in our body. Our byproduct that we produce is carbon dioxide. And we're going to see here in a minute how carbon dioxide can affect the acidity of fluids. And then there's also ammonia, which is basic, and that is also a byproduct of metabolic functions inside the body. So you have some acidic substances that are formed, we have a basic substance that is formed. So the job of the kidneys is to maintain the balance between the acids and the bases. The kidneys aren't alone in this though. Their respiration also plays a role in the acid-base balance, and I believe we talked about that in the respiratory system. And then also blood buffers, and we'll talk a little bit about blood buffers in this next slide here. First thing, we have to understand about acids and bases before we can understand what's going on here. So the definition of an acid is a proton donor, or in other words, an H-positive donor. So remember, H stands for hydrogen. A hydrogen atom has an atomic number of 1, which means that it's basically just a proton, a positive proton floating around. If it has an electron orbiting that proton, then it has a neutral charge. But notice here though, an H-positive ion, in the case of an H-positive ion, it has no electron, and so what that means is it is simply just a positively charged proton floating around. So an acid is something that donates H-positive ions. Strong acids are going to totally dissociate, and I'll show you what that means here in just a minute. Totally dissociate in water into H-positive ions. Weak acids only partially dissociate. Bases, on the other hand, are what we call proton acceptors. So instead of giving up protons, they accept protons. And again, strong bases dissociate into water, weak bases don't as much. So let's look at what this means here. Here's a little drawing. Hydrochloric acid, or HCl, is a very strong acid. Notice that it's made up of a hydrogen ion and a chloride ion. If we were to write this out a little bit differently, we'd have a relationship like this. This is an ionic bond, if you remember clear back to when we talked about chemistry. H positive is just a proton. Chloride ion has an extra electron floating around. Positive and negative attract, and that's why we are able to form this HCl. But if you put HCl into water, the H positive and the Cl negative, they dissociate. They're no longer bonded ionically together. So the water is able to pull these things apart, basically. So when you dump HCl into water, notice how all the H positives come apart and they're just floating around. So this is an acid because we've donated protons. These protons are no longer attached to chloride ions, they're just floating around in the water. So this is a very strong acid. On the other hand, over here we have bicarbonate. So in this case we have two H positive ions and a CO3 with a 2 negative charge and another H positive ion. When you put this into water, you only get a partial dissociation. So this again, it's ionically bonded together, so the H positive ions can come off, but not all of them do. So only partially dissociate. So this acid is not as strong. If all of the H positives were to dissociate, it'd be very strong. But in this case, notice only some of them came off, and we form HCO3 with one negative. This H is still associated there. And so this would be what we call a buffer. So we're going to focus on that buffer, that carbonic acid. Oh, I think in this slide, did I call that the wrong? So H2CO3 is carbonic acid. HCO3 negative is bicarbonate ion. Carbonic acid, bicarbonate ion. So we're going to focus on this because this is our buffer. This is our weak acid that can help buffer the effects of a strong acid. Because what happens is, depending on the acidity or the alkalinity of the solution, that buffer is that carbonic acid is going to behave a little bit differently. So let's look at what happens here. So if you have carbonic acid, H2CO3, and you put this this is going to be formed in the case when you have a strong acid. So carbonic acid, this is a weak acid, it acts as our buffer. So if you were to add a strong acid to a solution that has sodium bicarbonate, you have an Na positive and HCO3, so this is our bicarbonate, this is our sodium. If you add a strong acid and you have sodium bicarbonate in that solution, we have a strong acid, a weak base, they're going to interact with each other. So this HCO3 is going to pick up the hydrogen ion, and the Cl will grab the Na positive. And so what we end up is, instead of having a strong acid, as it interacts with this buffer, it's going to become a weak acid. We get carbonic acid out of this, which is weak, and then we get a salt that's going to precipitate out of this. So the NaCl, sodium ion, chloride ion are going to bond together ionically, and they're going to fall out of the solution. So in this case, strong acid, weak base equals a weak acid. The opposite is true if you have a strong base. So NaOH, or sodium hydroxide we call this, where you have Na positive and an OH negative ionically bonded together. Notice this OH negative here. This is a base because it accepts hydrogen ions. So if we were to add a hydrogen ion to this system here, we would end up with water. And so this base can accept hydrogens, but it is a strong base. So strong bases can be very corrosive, just like strong acids can. But if we put this strong base with a weak acid, so here's our carbonic acid again, it's going to dissociate so that the Na positive adds to the weak acid. So a strong base and a weak acid is buffered to a weak base, and then we get some water out of it here. So the point here is that this buffer is acting to lessen the effects of bases and acids that are coming in contact. So this is what's happening inside our body. As if the fluids get too acidic, then the buffer system is going to react to make that less acidic. It's going to make it into a weak acid. If our fluids get too basic, then the opposite's going to happen, and the buffer system is going to work to make it into a weak base. This is how our kidneys function in controlling the acid-base balance inside our body. This comes from carbon dioxide. So as carbon dioxide enters the blood, it is converted into bicarbonate ion. So this bicarbonate ion is produced here. So as CO2 adds to water, what you're going to end up with is this bicarbonate ion being formed. CO2 plus water is going to become a bicarbonate ion plus hydrogen. So it's going to increase the acidity of the blood. And it can also then further become carbonic acid, CO3, H2CO3. Anyway, so the CO2 concentration is what affects the buffer system inside our blood. So if it's becoming too acidic, we can get rid of CO2 through the respiratory system, and then that's going to push this system this way. We're going to end up with less of the bicarbonate ion. If we're getting if we want to go the other way, if it's getting too basic, then we can add CO2, we can keep more CO2 in the blood, and that's going to push it into the opposite direction. So our respiratory system comes into play here. But then also our kidneys can play a role as well. So they can release bicarbonate ions in the kidneys, in the urine, in order to affect this acid-base balance as well. So when our blood pH rises, then we get rid of those bicarbonate ions in the urine excreted by the kidneys. When the pH falls, as it becomes more acidic, then we're going to keep those bicarbonate ions, we're going to reabsorb them, and we're going to get rid of hydrogen ions. So there's this relationship here between hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So if it's basic, we want to keep the hydrogen ions because that's going to make it more acidic and balance it. If it's more acidic, then we want to get rid of those hydrogen ions, keep the bicarbonate to buffer that system, keep it at the correct pH. So pH of the urine, although the blood has to maintain a very narrow range, the urine can fluctuate a lot depending on how we're trying to maintain the acidity of the blood. So that's its function there. Okay, so that's how the acid-base balance is maintained. The last thing to mention here is the developmental aspects of the urinary system. So by the 3rd month of pregnancy, as growth is happening, the kidneys are developed, but the urinary system of the newborn is not totally functional and developed. So the bladder's small, urine can't be concentrated, and so infants urinate a lot, as you know if you've had kids. So up to 5 to 40 times a day. It's an amazing number there, as their urinary system continues to develop. Being able to control the urinary system, and this comes into kind of the potty training type idea here. Infants or young children don't have voluntary control until around the age of 18 months, and that's going to vary from individual to individual. And they don't have complete, especially nighttime control, until around 4 years old. And so, getting angry at your child for wetting the bed at night may not be totally justified because they may just not have control of that yet. And so that comes with age. And besides urinary infections, which happen and happen quite relatively often in young kids, but then continue through, especially more common in women than men because of the short urethra in women and its proximity to the digestive system, to the feces. Urinary infections can happen because urinary infections are caused mostly by E. coli, which is a type of bacteria that's found in our digestive system and is released out with feces. And so if any of those E. coli get into the urethra and into your urinary tract, they can cause an infection. And then over time, as you get older, then you start to have some urinary problems. Urinary function decreases with age, your bladder shrinks, you lose that bladder tone, and then suddenly all sorts of problems happen. Urgency, which is a feeling that you have to void. Frequency, where you had to void a lot, but you're not really getting rid of a lot. Nocturia, where you have to get up in the middle of the night to urinate. Incontinence, where you no longer have control. So just like in young kids, when you have the elderly, they're going to start having incontinence. Urinary retention, which happens in males. Remember that prostate gland is around the mouth of that urethra. So if it enlarges, it's going to squeeze that shut, and so that's going to cause problems in trying to void. You'll need to void, but you won't be able to. And so if nothing else is able to fix that, then you may have to have a catheter inserted in order to get rid of that urine. So lots of things to look forward to with old age here, dealing with the urinary system. So, all right, and that's all we have to talk about this system. Hopefully you enjoyed learning about this, and the next section we do is going to be the last one to learn this semester.